Hey, I'm here to talk for a little while about immigrants and nativists, which is a subject that we have a lot of fun talking about in the current day, but we're not arguing about immigrants coming across our southern border. We're going to talk about mostly the Irish and the Germans. Here's a quote from a nativist. The problem with defending the purity of the English language is that the English language is as pure as a crib house whore. It not only borrows words from other languages, it has, on occasion, chased other languages down dark alleyways and clubbed them unconscious and rifled their pockets for new vocabulary. The idea of anybody being a Native American other than the actual Native American seems kind of silly to us. But right around the 1820s to 1840s, there was a whole bunch of people who had very strong opinions about that, which is ironic because most of the immigrants who were coming into Europe were coming into Europe because of things that are kind of America's fault. So let's talk about that for a minute. Let's see the immigrants and the natives, this and how they, first thing we need to talk about is the Irish. And in order to talk about the Irish, we have to talk about this special word here, diaspora. A diaspora is when a people is scattered away from their homeland. When you take a people that have a place where they belong and because of a circumstance that's completely usually out of their control, suddenly they scatter all over the world. The Irish diaspora is one of the widest in history. There are Irish people on literally every continent. And part of the reason for that is because of this thing that happened in the early 1800s that's kind of weirdly our fault. So let's talk about what happened to the Irish. Now, to begin with, Irish people have been fleeing from Ireland for like a really long time. In the 1600s, and you'll be able to read this slide later, but in the 1600s, Puritans banned Catholics, and most of Ireland was Catholic. So the Anglicans in England, who had control over the Irish landscape, banned Catholicism, which was basically banning the religion of basically an entire country. When people wanted to maintain their Catholicism anyway, the British punished them by taking things away from them. Couldn't vote, couldn't hold office, couldn't own land, couldn't own firearms, couldn't educate or couldn't get education for your children, couldn't adopt children, all because you were a lower class citizen because you were Catholic. So the other thing was that because of the way that the Catholic laws were set up, when landholders died, they split up all their land between all of their male relatives. So it was, unless one of their male relatives was Protestant, in which case that male relative inherited everything, which means like, okay, if you're the father of a large family and you have 5 sons and you and all of your sons and all their wives are Catholic, but you have a brother who married a woman who was Protestant and then died, and his Protestant widow raised their son to be Protestant, that means that your entire inheritance is going to skip right over your 5 sons and land in that nephew's lap. This was a way of taking power away from the Catholics, especially the Irish Catholics. In between 1830 and 1836, the British punished the Catholics by requiring them to pay a tithe to the Anglican Church, which means the money you put in the offering plate at your church when you're Catholic doesn't apply, and you have to also pay a tithe to the Anglican Church. Like, you can be Catholic, but then the priest has to hand over the offering plate to the Anglicans. Eventually, there was a big protest about it, a big war. Before 1845, most of the people who immigrated out of Ireland and into America were young single people who were trying to create a stake for their families, who were trying to create a place to live. When they arrived in America, they were poor, they had nothing, they were wanderers, and they had come over kind of as a rite of passage to prove themselves, so they were a little attitude-y, to be honest, or at least that was the reputation that they got locally. They would come into the American cities, and then they'd trickle out into the American countryside, but they didn't own anything, so they always had to sell their labor. Instead, they had to hire them. Then something happened that sort of changed all of that. Now, this is called the Late Blight. It's actually got a much longer name, which you can see here, and you are welcome to try to pronounce that. But the Late Blight was something that specifically affected potatoes. Now, follow my chain of logic here. Okay, the potato blight, the particular breed of mold, only grows in the Andes Mountains, which are down here. These are the Andes Mountains. Okay, the seed potatoes that carry this mold were seed potatoes that were traded up into the Gulf of Mexico. The Gulf of Mexico would then trade them up into French and Spanish, Louisiana and Florida, who would then trade them with America, who would then trade them with Europe. Now, up until the 1830s and 1840s, that was a very slow travel. You would travel from the Andes all the way over. By the time you got to Europe, it was a very slow process because it was wagons all the way up the land. It was wagons across the Ohio River Valley, or ships directly from the Andes to Europe, and it would have to go through those mercantile empires to get there. But as we talked about in our last video, America has made some communications and transportation advances. So in the mid 1840s, it is suddenly possible for a ship to go into New Orleans, go up the Mississippi in a matter of days, go across the Ohio River Valley on a train in a matter of days, and thanks to faster ships, because ship technology has improved, what with the whole international slave trading being illegal and therefore, in need of better technology in order to keep going, ships that go across to Europe are much faster. So seed potatoes from the Andes were able to arrive in Denmark to be traded with Britain and Ireland with the mold still inside and not showing itself yet. If that had happened in an earlier time with less travel technology, the mold would have revealed itself and that load of potatoes would have been thrown out. But instead, it managed to make the whole trip in a much shorter amount of time, which made it possible for the entire... Now, it just also happens to be a bad luck that Ireland only has one kind of potato. It only grew one kind of potato, and it happened to be the kind of potato that was most defenseless against this particular mold. Under the boot of the British, the Irish starved to death because all of their food and agricultural products that weren't potatoes went to Britain, and what they ended up with was potatoes that were killed off by this blight. So let's talk about some numbers. In 1846, 3/4 of the crop was destroyed. In 1847, 2 million people were dead of starvation and related illnesses, and between 1814 and 1845, 1.5 million Irish people immigrated to other countries, specifically America. That's a 30-year period, 1.5 million. But in 1847, 250,000 Irish immigrants moved in 1 year to flee from this starvation and this panic. So it was really, we kind of caused that famine, not we, because obviously we're historians. Americans in the mid-1800s kind of caused that famine through no fault of their own, but through transportation technology. It made it possible for that blight to arrive intact in Ireland. And then when the Irish fled to the American shores, the Native Americans reacted badly. They weren't the only immigrants coming in. German immigrants were also flooding in for all kinds of reasons. German immigrants were fleeing from a number of things. There was revolution, liberalists who were seeking universal male suffrage and equality, and all those things that we talk about in the Enlightenment. Individual rights was suddenly kicking off all of these little revolutions all over Europe, but especially in Germany. And people, Prussia and Austria and Bavaria were all getting into fights with each other and with France, and it was messy and it was complicated, and people fled from that. In 1848, that all kind of was settled, but at the end of that, there were people that were being taxed much more than they were before. There were landowners who were kind of being kicked off land, so they came to America. Political refugees from Austria, Bavaria, and especially Catholics, because Germany was not Catholic anymore. Germany is where the Lutheran movement started. So again, Catholics coming. German tended to move into communities. They usually arrived with their own money. Unlike the Irish, they arrived with their own money. They were ready to create their own communities. They didn't really have any interest in participating in the American narrative and being part of the American language. They were just like, we just want land, and then we'll rebuild our little community here. Just leave us alone. And that created a lot of resentment by the Americans who were already here. They were like, they're building these little villages where only they get to live, and they don't like other people very much. I don't like that. They also managed to kick off a fairly successful brewery industry that meant that they ended up with more prosperity after arriving, which they didn't really share very much. So nativists, which were people who were basically people who had been from England and had lived here a couple of generations, began to pass all kinds of laws in order to in order to clamp down on the immigrants that were coming in. And you can read about this. I'll post this PowerPoint. You can read some of these things. But one of the big sentiments that this brought out was anti-Catholic sentiment. People who believe, the Germans and Irish believed that Catholics were patriarchal. That means that they followed the guidance of their own head of their family instead of following the guidance of whatever political person you thought that they should. They were anti-Republican, and I don't mean that they were, don't think of Republican and Democrat as having anything to do with modern history, but they didn't believe in representation the same way that the Americans did, because they believed that there was a sort of one of those wonderful triangle systems, that allows for a structure, and everybody inside the structure should keep their place, and the people at the top should be at the top, whereas, the whole idea of America is everybody getting an equal chance to be a representative, theoretically. They tended to be wildly alcoholic. Both Germans and Irish tended to be pretty much into their beer and into their drinks, and also drank on Sunday, which the Anglican Puritan, remember this is Massachusetts Bay that they're all coming into, New York and Boston, Puritans tended to be anti-alcohol. So, and one last thing is that they were, you can't probably see this word, but it says subject to the Pope. They believed that if it came down to a fight between the president and the Pope would win for these people, and that was bad. That was anti. So, a whole party of people that came out of New England who were anti-Catholic, anti-immigrant, and, by the way, also, incidentally, didn't like Andrew Jackson very much, who called themselves the National Republicans. This is the end of those Federalist people up in New England that almost seceded during the War of 1812. This is where they ended up pouring into this political party called the Whigs, which was named for a revolutionary story when Scotland was fighting with England. It has nothing to do with their hair on their heads. They took their name from a revolutionary group in Scotland. They called themselves the Whigs. And the Whigs were very anti-Catholic, anti-immigrant, anti-Southern Plantation Democrat, anti all of those things. You're going to read Samuel Morse's a segment from Samuel Morse's quote. Now, this is the guy that invented the telegraph. If you saw the other video, we talked about his contribution. But he was also very nativist and very against Catholics. So take a look at that document and see if you can spot what he thinks will happen and what is the great big underlying monster of these immigrants coming into America. And I will see you soon. Again, I will publish this PowerPoint without me babbling on your Blackboard along with my notes, and you need to take a look at them because they'll probably be on the test later, and hopefully I'll get to